It's Adam here for PC Monitors, and in this video I'm going to be taking a look at the Philips Evnia 34M2C7600MV. I think I said that correctly. As usual, what you see in the video depends on my camera, it depends on the processing done by my video editing software, it depends on the processing done by YouTube, and ultimately and importantly it depends on the screen that you're actually viewing the video on. So in no way will it accurately represent what you'd see with the monitor firsthand. As usual, there is a written review which goes into more technical detail about this monitor. You can find a link to that in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do. Be aware that liking the video, subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, a nice way of showing your support. So this monitor uses a 34-inch VA panel from CSOT. It has a 1152 zone mini LED backlight, and it has a 165Hz refresh rate. This might all sound familiar to you if you saw my review of the VESA XG34M2C7600MV, which I looked at just before this model. That's because they do share the same panel, so there are definite similarities. There are some slight differences, and I'll try and highlight some of those as I go through in the review. You might be able to tell that I sound a little bit different today. That's because I do have a bit of a sore throat, so I'm going to try and keep the talking to a minimum, but I can't promise this is going to be a super quick review. I do like to be quite detailed and quite thorough, as many of you will know. So the curve of the monitor, that's something which is exaggerated in pictures and videos, including the one you're looking at right now. It looks like there's a sort of pin cushion effect in the middle. You don't see that to the eye, and actually you'll adapt quite quickly. Most people that use this monitor will adapt very quickly. You'll use it for perhaps a few days and then you'll stop noticing the curve. It'll just be part of the experience. It's not really something you're actively aware of. Even when you're on the desktop, or even when I'm on the desktop, I didn't find this particularly distracting or annoying or anything like that. And it has potential viewing comfort advantages, and it brings the edges a bit closer to your eyes, and it gives a more uniform viewing experience between the center and the edges of the screen. So it does have some benefits, and I feel it works with a monitor as wide as this. So in terms of the pixel density, it's very similar to a 27-inch QHD, that's 2560 by 1440 model. So that's a decent level, not super tight pixel density or anything like that, but not weak either, quite good in that respect, quite decent, perfectly respectable. So you get decent text clarity. The monitor doesn't have any weird issues with its subpixels either, so that doesn't cause any issues with text clarity. You don't have to worry about that. It's good for multitasking. You can have a lot of content on the screen at the same time, and if you happen to be using applications which use a lot of horizontal screen real estate, such as video editing, so there will be a big timeline along the bottom here if I'd actually edited a video properly here, but this is just a template I use instead. But you get the idea. There's lots of horizontal screen space, so it's good for that kind of thing as well. And there are also benefits to be had for suitable movie content and games, and there's an article on the website all about the 3440 by 1440 resolution, and that is linked to in the written review, and there's a little bit about that there. So if you're interested, do check that out. But I will of course be showing some gameplay as well. Most games do support the aspect ratio just fine and the resolution just fine, and you will benefit from a higher field of view compared to a 16:9 monitor. I'm now going to talk about the external features of the monitor. So as you can see, it has an interesting look. It has a mixture of white and silver mainly. So the stand base there, it has blue speckling. It looks grey in most lights, but it's actually got a slight blue tint to the speckling. The rest of it is white, and that is matte plastic. The stand neck, that's coated metal at the sides, gives a nice weighty and premium feel to the overall product, in my opinion. The silver bottom bezel is matte plastic. The top and side bezels have a dual stage design. So there is a slim panel border flush with the rest of the screen. Difficult to see when the screen is switched off, but elsewhere in the review when the screen is switched on, you'll be able to see this panel border around the image. It's always there regardless of whether the screen's switched on or off, it's just part of the panel. And then there is a slim outer plastic part to the bezel as well, which is difficult to see against my wall as it is white like my wall, but you can see it there. The 1500R moderately steep curve to the screen I've already been through. It has a light matte anti-glare screen surface, so this means it offers decent glare handling. Isn't as strong as some matte screen surfaces in that respect, but stronger than others. So in brighter conditions, you can get patches of glare, and because of the curve of the screen, that can sort of be spread across the screen as well. If you view it off angle, that becomes a lot clearer. And if there's strong direct light, there's a little bit there, a little bit of light from a window at this particular angle, then you can see some sharper glare patches. This doesn't happen as much as it would on lighter matte screen surfaces, and it certainly isn't like a glossy screen surface where you get some sharper reflections in brighter conditions. And I explore the screen surface a little bit more in the contrast section as well. At the rear, the screen has a lot of matte white plastic, and it has this interesting geometric design. So you can see it's composed of squares. You can also see the stand in all its glory from this angle. The stand also offers good ergonomic flexibility. You can adjust the height, you can tilt the screen backwards and forwards, and you can swivel it left and right. And the base is reasonably deep, but not super deep. It's not as deep as the ViewSonic alternative, which has a very deep stand base, but it's not the most compact design either. As I said though, nice robust feel to it, and the adjustments are nice and smooth. I give exact measurements for these adjustments in the written review if you're interested. There's also a headphone hook at the top there. That isn't retractable, it's always there, part of the stand. And there's also a cable tidy mechanism at the bottom there. You also notice what look like little holes all around the monitor at the top and at the sides. They're actually Ambiglow LEDs. There's also a strip of them down the middle and some more at the bottom. They're very bright, they're impressively bright, and I will show this a little bit in the contrast section of the review just so you can see them in action here as well. But that is explored along with the OSD in the OSD video, and you can control the OSD with the little joystick there. The monitor also includes two 5-watt DTS downfiring speakers, and they're explored a bit in the written review in the features and aesthetics section. But just to quickly mention, they're quite decent. They're not the best I've heard, but they're above average for a monitor really, so reasonably rich sound output you can expect from them. The ports are downfiring, and there's a little K slot, just mention that before I forget, just there. Because it's white, it's a little bit difficult to see the labels there, but you can just about see them. So there's a DC power input, which means the monitor has an external power brick. And it's a pretty broad one, as you can see there, it's quite large. I know you don't really have an idea of scale there, but I'll give you a picture of it next to a ruler, just so you can have a better idea of how long it is. There are two HDMI 2.1 ports, there's a DisplayPort 1.4 port, and there's a USB-C port. And with that USB-C port, you've got 90 watts of power delivery, DP alt mode, and upstream data capability. There's also a USB-B upstream port, that's a little square-shaped one there. And the monitor does have KVM functionality, so you can easily switch display inputs and assign USB peripherals connected to the monitor between multiple systems, between two different systems. You've got 4 USB 3.2 Gen 1 ports. The yellow coloured ones there, they also have a little lightning icon if you see next to USB. They support fast charging for connected devices. And there is a 3.5mm audio output. As usual, I like to say just a little bit about the capabilities of the ports, of the display inputs more specifically. So with HDMI and DisplayPort, both of those will support the full 3440 by 1440 at up to 165 Hz. You get HDR support, you get adaptive sync support, and with HDMI 2.1 there's also HDMI 2.1 VRR. The monitor also has a 4K UHD downsampling mode, which games console users might find particularly useful. That gives you 4K UHD at up to 60 Hz. Now, the HDMI 2.1 ports on this monitor, they're not full bandwidth, but they're 24 gigabits per second. So in terms of bandwidth, this monitor should actually be able to output 4K UHD at 120 Hz, but it just doesn't include a downsampling mode that goes that high. That could be potentially added with a future firmware, but that isn't something I have information on at this point. And you can find out more about the capabilities of the ports in the features and aesthetics and the specifications section of the written review. Just something to quickly mention, the monitor does have an integrated cooling fan, just a little low-powered fan. I didn't find this bothersome at all when I was using the monitor. I didn't notice it above the noise of my system. It did ramp up a bit when the monitor got warmer, so under HDR for example, but my system fans also ramp up there and I didn't find it bothersome. If I got my ears close to the monitor, I certainly was aware the fan was there, but it isn't something I'd worry about. I know that some people prefer to avoid monitors with fans, they just prefer it isn't used, but unfortunately for powerful LED backlight solutions like this, it is common to have a fan, and even with OLED screens it's common to find some form of cooling solution like that as well. And I'm going to talk about the contrast performance of the monitor. And I like to start off with black crush. That's a VA characteristic. I like to use this little PCM black crush test, super scientific, just something I totally made up. And what this has is it has PCM written in exactly the same color, or the same shade throughout the screen. It's a dark grey shade, and the background is even darker. And you'll probably be able to see the section of the screen in line with the camera. The PCM text isn't as clear, it blends into the background more readily, and you'll see that the visibility improves towards the edge of the screen, or the edges of the screen, the side edges, also lower down and a bit further up. But basically the area of the screen in line with your eyes is more blended than the rest of the screen, and that can mask some detail. That's what black crush is. Perceived gamma is increased for those darker shades, and they do blend in more readily into a sort of black mass, if you like, or a dark mass, and that does mask detail. Further out, there's a bit of excessive detail, so the gamma is actually a bit low there. Something to be aware of though is that my unit, the gamma calibration, was such that the black crush was actually reduced a bit. The extra detail peripherally was increased a little bit. That's because the gamma at the low end was actually slightly lower than the 2.2 target. So that does give a bit of an uplift of detail naturally, and that did offset the black crush a little bit. And actually this panel isn't particularly bad when it comes to black crush. It's not an extreme amount of this. I've certainly seen a lot more on some VA models. So it isn't something I'd really worry about too much. It's just something that I like to mention for completeness. I'm now on Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and I'm going to talk about the contrast performance of the monitor using some in-game examples. The monitor's VA panel has contrast as one of its main strengths. So the static contrast is around 3500 to 4000 to 1, depending on the settings you use. So that's good enough to give you a nice depth and atmosphere to darker areas of games like this, to darker scenes, and also darker shades within scenes. So it can help give you a more defined look to shadows and little cracks in rocks, vegetation detail, that kind of thing. It can just help things stand out a little bit more with more definition as well. That doesn't mean it gives you the same kind of experience that an OLED would give you in a dark room with its absolute depth and inkiness, but compared to most LCDs, it's very good. There's also VA glow to be aware of. You'll be able to see that in the video towards the bottom of the screen, sort of a lightening up of the dark shades there. Might be exaggerated a bit in the video actually. And depending on your viewing position, you might see that further up the screen. That's something which will increase if you're sitting closer to the screen, if you're using a higher brightness setting, and if you happen to have a unit with particular issues with backlight bleed or clouding. Mine wasn't too bad in that respect. You can see that in the contrast section of the written review. But there is going to be a bit of VA glow either way. Unless you're sitting very far from the monitor and very centrally, then that will eventually eliminate the VA glow. But it's really just a moderate amount, sort of quite typical to what I'd see on ultra-wide VA models normally. There's also the black crush, which I've mentioned. That is a factor in games as well, not just when you're looking at the little PCM black crush test. That was just to help highlight it more clearly because it's very difficult to show you in videos. But I can see that there is a masking of detail more centrally, whereas more peripherally there's a bit of an excess of detail. Not extreme black crush, not extreme excess of detail either. And I do like to mention the excess of detail in terms of streamed content as well. Heavily compressed stream content has a lot of what are called compression artifacts in. If you have a lot of this unmasking of detail, things not looking as blended as they should for dark shades, then it can make them more noticeable. So you get a little bit of that here because of the extra detail, but not an extreme amount. So if, for example, I was to compare this to the worst VA models I've used, nothing like that. And if I compare this to a TN model where you look at some of the shifts they have vertically, nothing like that either. But it just doesn't have the absolute consistency you get on an OLED monitor or as strong as you'd see on an IPS LCD. For brighter shades, the light matte anti-glare screen surface gives just a little bit of layering, not as much as some matte screen surfaces provide in front of the image, and just a little bit of light misty graininess, as I'd call it. So it isn't the smoothest or lightest matte screen surface out there, but it certainly isn't the heaviest or graininess or smeariest, whatever you want to call it. So it's something I'm very sensitive to, and this screen surface I think most people will find very agreeable, even if you sometimes find some matte screen surfaces a bit annoying. Focusing in again on the darker areas, so you will note that I'm sitting in a pitch black room at the moment. There's no light behind the monitor, there's no light in the room. This monitor does have an ambi-glow setting, which gives you a bias light behind the monitor. It's a nice strong RGB LED solution, and it can act as a bias light, and it's quite customizable. I do look at this in the OSD video, but I'm just going to activate the feature now, so just to talk a little bit about what this can do for you. So I'm just going to set it to a static white at the brightest setting available. The camera has become a little bit overwhelmed by the level of brightness because it is quite bright, especially in a dark room. But that is good in terms of acting as a bias light, so it enhances the perceived contrast. It doesn't actually change the physical contrast of the monitor, but it helps take an edge off the VA glow, and some of the shades just appear darker and deeper to the eye. Again, I wouldn't say it makes it look like an OLED or anything like that, and if you really sort of focus on the screen itself and start looking at that kind of thing, you can see, yeah, okay, so it's not pure black and it's not as deep and inky as it could be, but it just gives you a bit of an edge. I've brightened the room up a bit, turned the ambi-glow solution off. It's not exactly a bright room, it's what I describe as moderately bright, I suppose, and again, that takes the edge off the VA glow, and you could argue that the perceived contrast is improved, but actually you will see some glare on the screen, and that's diffused across the screen. There isn't a lot of direct light striking the screen surface. I've got quite a controlled lighting environment here, so this could be worse depending on your lighting environment. If you've got light striking the screen directly, you'll see more of this diffused hazing across the screen. That's just something that you have to put up with matte screen surfaces to some degree. And it isn't extreme on this model because it's a light matte anti-glare screen surface. It offsets that a little bit, except I would say that if you're viewing it off angle, then the hazing becomes rather noticeable. You can see that there. But if you're sitting quite centrally and you have at least reasonable control of your lighting, even if you've got a bit of brightness in the room, I wouldn't worry too much about that. It certainly gives a different look with the dark room, but I do like to show both and talk a little bit about both because I do appreciate that not everyone is going to be sitting in a dark room. In fact, I spend most of my time in a better lit room when I'm using monitors, so it's certainly worth a mention. I'm now going to talk about the colour reproduction of the monitor, and to start off I like to use Lagom, lagom.nl, the website, and the tests for viewing angles. So the Lagom text would ideally look a consistent blended grey throughout the screen, but here you can see that there's some red striping to the text peripherally towards the edges of the screen and more so towards the bottom corners. The area that's in line with your eyes or in line with the camera in this case, which is sort of a little bit above the central region, that appears more blended. And then there's a bit of a green striping to the text as well, and a sort of bit of orange, then becomes red. So there are some inconsistencies. The sort of cone, if you like, is quite broad in terms of the area which is the most blended, whereas on some VA models with weaker viewing angle performance and weaker colour consistency, that cone would be tight and then it would very suddenly become highly saturated, the Lagom text here. So that indicates that there's a moderate viewing angle dependency to the gamma curve of the monitor. If you look at solid shades, this one always appears weird on the video, so I'm just going to have to talk you through it. But to the eye, it appears a pinkish purple throughout, but it has a stronger pink tint towards the edges of the screen. For some reason, it looks like it has a strong pink tint centrally on the video, but that isn't how it appears to the eye. So there are some slight shifts. The red block, that appears a good vibrant red throughout the screen, a bit more pinkish, more of a faded red, I guess, towards the edges of the screen, particularly the bottom corners. The green block appears nice saturated green chartreuse shade throughout the screen, a little bit of extra yellowing towards the extreme edges, but nothing particularly noteworthy. The blue block appears a good rich royal blue throughout the screen. So there are some losses of saturation basically towards the edges of the screen for some shades, and particularly towards the bottom from a normal viewing position. If you view the monitor more centrally or from lower down, then you can see this loss of saturation more further up the screen. I'm now on Battlefield 2042 and I'm going to talk about colour reproduction using some in-game examples. Overall, the monitor does provide a vibrant look to things. The colour gamut is rather generous. Someone just stole my vehicle there, never mind, I don't need it. For most content you consume, that includes games under SDR, as I'm running this game at the moment, it's designed with the sRGB colour space in mind. That's what the developers have in mind when they're creating the content. And if you're viewing it Using the native gamut of a monitor like this, which is much wider than sRGB, you get extra saturation and extra vibrancy. So I'm just going to flash the color gamut up on the screen. I measured 95% of the DCI-P3 color space, and that's shown in the comparison here. Also compared with sRGB, you can see it's a lot wider than sRGB. There's actually some overextension beyond DCI-P3 in some regions as well, particularly that red to blue edge. There's a lot of extension there, very generous gamut there, particularly in the red region. And for those interested, I measured 90% Adobe RGB. So for the green to blue edge, it doesn't have as much extension as Adobe RGB. So with all of this in mind, the monitor does provide a good level of vibrancy, strong vibrancy. Yes, there are some saturation losses further down the screen and towards the edges, but they're not extreme, about as low as I've seen from a VA model, particularly an ultra-wide VA model. But the red paint there is very eye-catching. The greens, the trees and the grass and the vegetation in the background, also very eye-catching. Some of the greens are brought out a bit too strongly as well. They don't look as muted as they should, but I wouldn't say they look neon, and they don't have the same intensity they do on a monitor which has greater Adobe RGB coverage, for example. Same with the sky blues as well. Definite oversaturation there, but it's not extreme. But definitely the red bias shades have a lot of pop. So it's not just painted red elements like this, it would also be explosions. That's a smoke grenade. That's not really what I was trying to show you. So let's just pretend there were some fires here. They have a nice warming glow to them. I'll see if I can create a fire somehow. Fires, yes, I've managed to create a fire. Has a very nice vibrant look to it. Strong reddish oranges and yellows that do verge a bit too much on orange, but a vibrant look nonetheless. If you want to tone things down, you prefer a more as the developers intend look, the monitor does offer an sRGB setting. This works correctly if you have the monitor set to the standard mode. It looks like it's available elsewhere, but it's only in the standard mode where it actually does the correct thing and clamps the gamut. With this enabled, you can adjust the brightness, and it looks like you can adjust the gamma and the color temperature, but you actually can't. If you try to make any adjustments there, then it will just disable the setting. It's toned down the red paint, the sky looks more neutral as well, the greens are toned down. So things do look more muted, more as the developers intend, closer to the original sRGB intentions, in other words. So if you're looking to do a bit of photo editing or color critical work with this monitor, I don't generally recommend VA models for that as highly as IPS models or perhaps OLEDs as well. And that's because of the color consistency, the losses of saturation, shifts in saturation and gamma, which I've talked about. But you do get good potential here in terms of the gamut for work within the DCI-P3 color space. That 95% DCI-P3 is good. 90% Adobe RGB, I'd say that's not really sufficient for work within the Adobe RGB color space, not ideal for that. And you get full sRGB coverage, and if you don't happen to have a colorimeter or similar device, which I would recommend for the highest level of accuracy, that you calibrate the monitor, profile it fully. If you don't have the option, then you do at least have that sRGB mode to fall back on. It's actually quite well calibrated. Philips promise a delta E below 2, and I can confirm that with my own readings. You can see a little bit more about that in the calibration section of the written review if you're interested. I do explore this mode in more detail in the written review. But it is a pretty good sRGB emulation mode if you need to use that, or if you want to use that. I'm back on Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and now I'm running the game under HDR. The monitor has VESA DisplayHDR 1400 certification, so that's the highest level for LCDs that VESA will certify for. Just a few things to be aware of. I'm using an RTX 3090 connected via DisplayPort, but I have tested via HDMI. I've tested an AMD RX 580 as well with HDMI and DisplayPort, and the HDR experience is largely consistent regardless of the connection used and the GPU used. Only one slight thing I noticed is that with my AMD GPU, when I had it running at 165 Hz and I had VRR active, because you can use VRR at the same time as HDR on this monitor, and with local dimming and all of that enabled at the same time. But if I had VRR active 165 Hz on my AMD GPU, HDR looked kind of a bit flooded, a bit washed out, not as saturated as it should. I don't know if that's an issue with this monitor and the AMD root specifically, because that is an old GPU. It's several generations old now, and the port is sort of not the newest. It is DisplayPort 1.4, but I don't know if it has full DSC capability or anything like that. But anyway, works just fine on my newer NVIDIA GPU, and the monitor does have 1152 dimming zones, so that is a good number of dimming zones. It's not a huge number if you compare to the 5 or so million pixels of the monitor. So you get nowhere near the dimming precision you'd get on an OLED. So if I consider this particular scene here, there's actually a mixture of dark, somewhat darker and lighter shades. With an OLED, it could give exceptional depth to the cracks and the rocks there. Medium shades would be very dark, bright shades would be immediately brighter, that kind of thing. So you don't get that kind of precision, but the overall atmosphere for the darker shades here is good. There are some issues to be aware of, which I will cover when I get to them, when there are sort of darker and medium dark shades dominating without any brighter shades mixed in. There are some issues with visibility, and again I will come on to those. And you do get some blooming and haloing, so you can see the bright crosshair there. There's a bit of haloing around it. You can see it perhaps more clearly around the HUD elements towards the bottom right, but I've got some better scenes for showing this, which I'll show you a little bit later. The bright shades there from the daylight, very bright indeed. Not super bright. The sun isn't streaming in here, it's sort of just passively illuminated, so it's not trying to go for the maximum brightness of the monitor here or anything, but it's still very bright there, and the depth there is very good, but there was some masking of detail there as well, and I'll come on to that a little bit later on. There are different modes, HDR modes on this monitor, but the only one I'd really recommend using is the DisplayHDR 1400 mode or 1400 mode. HDR Photo and Personal appear very similar. I'm sorry that you can't really read this because it's super bright and it's massively overexposed. I'll see if I can fix that up so you can read it. There you go, at least you can see what it says now. So HDR Photo overall is very similar to DisplayHDR 1400, or it seems to be on my unit anyway. Personal is very similar as well, except it has this setting called Light Enhance. If you have that disabled, then it looks very similar to DisplayHDR 1400. But if you increase this, it brightens shades up a lot. It really sort of crushes things together. It brightens shades up too much. It gives an artificial and flooded look, which I don't really like. And it doesn't look as it should under HDR. But if you happen to like how this looks, then you can play around with that. HDR Movie, that also looks flooded, overly brightened, but if you like a lot of detail under HDR, so you don't want any masking of dark detail, then this could be something to try. An HDR Game, which takes things to the extreme. It looks very flooded. The contrast is actually crushed completely. The contrast is nowhere near where it should be with this setting, and things just don't look HDR-like at all for that reason. With this all said, back to my preferred DisplayHDR 1400 setting, and let's put some numbers to things now and crack out the graphs. So there are 3 different local dimming settings. There's weak, medium, and strong, and a high level here will light bias more, and a lower level will dark bias more. So what that means is where there are mixtures of darker and brighter shades, and you remember that there are a tiny number of dimming zones really compared to the number of pixels of the monitor does have to compromise, and it will have to decide, does it want to show the dark shades well with good depth and it will give potentially good atmosphere, or does it want to brighten up so it shows those bright shades correctly for those dimming zones, nice and bright. It'll have to make a compromise somewhere between the two. So with more dark biasing, so the weak setting and to a fair extent the medium setting, edge more towards the depth and atmosphere, whereas with the strong setting it will edge a bit more towards higher brightness. But either way, the monitor does have some degree of dark biasing sort of built into it anyway. But you can see some of the differences on the graph here if you look at the white patch size 1%. So for those who aren't familiar, white patch size, there's a block of white in the middle of the screen covering 1% of the pixels, 4%, 9%, 25%, 49% or 100%, and the rest of the screen is black in this test. But at 4% patch size and above, so for the larger bright elements, it doesn't matter which local dimming setting you use, it behaves in much the same way. And also remember that 1% of pixels are still thousands of pixels, so you will have some smaller bright elements than 1%, and that can potentially show some clearer differences between these settings. But I prefer the medium setting. I sort of think that's the Goldilocks setting, really. That's my preference. That's the setting I settled on, but do feel free to test the others yourself and see which you prefer. Anyway, not huge difference on this graph between the settings overall, but if you compare to the orange line, which shows the Dell Alienware AW3423DW, which is a QD OLED monitor, you'll see that the Philips is able to output greater brightness, particularly where brighter shades dominate. So it's sort of the inverse, in a way, of what the QD OLED shows. So the QD OLED, because it has per pixel illumination, it doesn't need to dark bias. So it can show small bright elements with brilliant brightness, and then immediately surrounding that, it can just really shut off the pixels if it needs to. So it doesn't have a problem there. But there are some power limitations with OLED to be aware of, where bright shades dominate, and that's why it dims. The automatic brightness limiter kicks in. Whereas with this Philips, you don't have that kind of issue. It maintains strong brightness even with 100% of the screen showing white, which is really the extreme example. It will sustain a brightness of 1106 nits. So that really is impressive in that respect. I'm just loading up Battlefield 5 so I can show you a different scene which will have a lot of bright shades. And you'll see here white text and a white little loading cursor against a black background. You can see some haloing, some blooming because it doesn't have per pixel illumination. And I'll give you some more examples of this, but overall I would say it's not bad on this monitor. The fact it's a VA panel and the fact it has a decent number of dimming zones does help, so it doesn't have an extreme amount of blooming or haloing. And I'll also mention at this point that the dimming zones are nice and reactive, so you don't get the kind of trailing of blooming or anything like that. There are definitely some responsiveness issues to be aware of, but they're not specific to the local dimming. They're actually broader on this monitor, and I'll come on to them in the responsiveness section. So this scene here on Battlefield 5, it really does look a lot better, a lot more as it should, than OLED monitors. So if you think about that ABL, automatic brightness limiter behavior I mentioned on OLEDs, it will dim a lot for scenes like this, or it will selectively dim depending on which part of the scene you're looking at. But here, on this monitor, you don't get that, and it can show really nice brightness for the sun there, the glints off the ice there as well, sort of the specular highlights if you like. And there's a nice natural glow around the clouds, nice silver lining there. And the sky in general just has a nice natural quality to it. It doesn't look flooded, but it does have this nice luminosity. I just love to use that word. Meanwhile, the darker elements such as the rocks here, the vegetation in the background there, the dimming zones can dim a lot there, keep them nice and dark. So I do feel that the HDR solution works really well for scenes like this. Back on good old Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and I just have to jump into the water here because I always do that in my reviews, so I have to show this scene. Just feel completely obligated to do so. And this is a scene which, for me, it's a nice scene just for showing decent versus not so decent HDR performance, and this is very much in the decent camp here. Really nice brightness. The glint of light on the water surface is very bright indeed. The glint on the waxy leaf there stands out nicely. This giant ball of light you can see there, yes, it doesn't look like that to the eye. It's a bit more like that, but you're not going to be able to see exactly what you'd see in person. Basically, it's nice and bright, definitely bright, but there's also a nice quality to the mists there, smooth gradients, and that's because under HDR the monitor is able to use 10-bit color processing rather than being stuck at 8-bit, which is really the maximum that's used for the vast majority of SDR content, certainly games. So this does give you nicer, gentler progressions of shades. It's also part of what can increase your distinction for darker shades, give you a nicer variety of closely matching dark shades. This isn't like the kind of uplift in detail you'd get with a gamma enhancement under SDR because it's achieved with a greater nuanced shade variety. It's a very different look. But I'm not going to sort of beat the drum about this too much because there are some issues to be aware of, which I'll come on to in another scene in terms of the visibility of darker shades. But overall, the representation of this scene is good. So you've got nice bright elements. and good depth to the darker shades. Medium shades, they have extra depth as well. So overall good representation here. I'm now back on that scene that I showed you under SDR when I was talking about contrast. And this is where some issues are apparent with the local dimming algorithm. So it seems to dark bias far too heavily where there are just mixtures of darker and sort of medium dark shades. So to the left of the screen there, it is really roughly how it appears on the video. There's just sort of a black mass. You really can't see the details. It's as if the dimming zones there are setting themselves to extremely low levels, which are very similar to if it was just displaying black or close to black, but it should actually be brightening up a little bit more than that, or certainly some of the dimming zones which are showing sort of medium dark shades should be brightening up a bit more than they are. You do get that to an extreme degree here as well. There's supposed to be little skulls in the background, and you can't see them here. Yes, it looks very deep, very atmospheric, and the monitor is able to respond to metadata which is telling it that this scene is supposed to look atmospheric, but it's gone too far here. And even if I look at some of the areas centrally illuminated by the torch, such as the skulls there just at the edge of the torch-lit area, they're also too dim. So it really is just dark biasing far too heavily here. I wouldn't expect things to look perfect here, but I'm just going to show you something. If I turn on movie, you'll be able to see these bones I was talking about revealed, but unfortunately things look completely flooded, as I mentioned before, with this setting, so it isn't a good compromise. Really, things should look somewhere between this and what I was showing you with the DisplayHDR 1400 setting. Again, I wouldn't expect perfection here because you don't get per pixel illumination. So OLEDs that I've seen, they handle this scene really well because there's actually an intricate mixture of dark and medium dark shades, or somewhat brighter shades. And you really do need per pixel illumination to have exceptional depth to the darkest shades while still showing good detail levels at the same time. That isn't possible with mini LEDs, but again, it has gone too far with the algorithm. There should be a little bit of the detail conserved still. I'll just adjust the camera exposure so you can see the menu, local dimming setting. It doesn't matter what you set this to, even if you set it to strong, which is the highest. It still dark biases very heavily here. And let's turn the solution off just so you can see how things look without it on. And I'll correct the camera exposure so it was like I was showing you before. You can now see that the backlight is just setting itself as one single unit without any local dimming to a high level. You can see more detail technically, although it looks completely flooded. You can still kind of see some of the skull detail or the bone detail through the ridiculous fog that you can see. But let's be honest, I don't think anyone is going to want to use HDR without local dimming on this monitor. It would be a huge waste. But I would like to see some tweaking to the algorithm if possible. This monitor does support upgradable firmware. I didn't notice this to the same extent on the ViewSonic XG34M2C7600MV, which is why I know it's not just a pure hardware limitation. Yes, there are some limitations with mini LEDs, as I mentioned. You don't get per pixel illumination, so it's not going to be perfect. But the ViewSonic shows that it can be tweaked and tuned better than it is here. And whilst I'm talking about the ViewSonic, it's worth mentioning that you could use local dimming under SDR on the ViewSonic, whereas that is not an option on this Philips monitor. I didn't love the local dimming under SDR on the ViewSonic because it had a very high locked brightness, which just doesn't work well for SDR. It really uplifted medium shades far too much and made some things look far too flooded. Really not as they should look. You don't get the same kind of tone mapping precision as you do under HDR, so it didn't work very well at all. But it was at least an option. And I have mentioned this to Philips already, and they've said they are exploring it as a possibility for future firmware, but no promises that they'll add that. I did say I was going to mention a little bit more about halos. Again, because it dark biases heavily overall and it's a VA panel with natively strong contrast, I wouldn't say these are a widespread or obvious issue, but you do get them in places. So I can see them around the HUD elements towards the bottom right there, but they're not super obvious. And actually even here the monitor is dark biasing with my preferred medium setting. It is dark biasing a bit, so it's not super brightening up those dimming zones. Therefore there aren't extreme halos here. I can see it around the bow as well with the medium shade, so it doesn't have to be pure black or very dark shades in the background to see this haloing. I can see it around the bow there as well. You'll probably be able to see that in the video. A little bit too much of a glow, and that's partly because of the haloing. So I think really this scene is one that does highlight some of the relative advantages that OLED would have over a mini LED solution like this. But if you look at the extremes of bright shades, dark shades mixed together without focusing so much on the level of detail and that kind of thing, and occasional halos, it does do a good job at showing really nice deep atmospheric dark shades and good light bright shades at the same time. Another important aspect of HDR is color reproduction. So unlike under SDR, where the developers had sRGB in mind, developers are able to target wider color gamuts such as DCI-P3 and ultimately Rec 2020. So this monitor does not offer full Rec 2020 coverage. It doesn't offer full DCI-P3 coverage either, but it offers 95% DCI-P3 and some extension beyond that as well. So some encroachment into Rec 2020. And this does allow a good level of vibrancy. And because these wider gamuts are actually being targeted here, it means that you don't get the kind of oversaturation that you see under SDR. So Lara's skin tone here looks nice and neutral. It doesn't look oversaturated. It doesn't look too tanned or too rich as it did under SDR, or it would have under SDR if I'd shown you this particular game or scene. But certainly I have observed this, and it applies to other game titles as well. And yes, there are some losses of saturation. So the saturation is best centrally for the central bulk of the screen, and a bit is lost particularly to the extreme side edges and bottom of the screen. But overall, good level of vibrancy where the developers want it. So that includes these green shades here. There's nice depth to these. They don't look overdone like they did under SDR. Not as strong as I've seen in terms of vibrancy as on some models with greater Adobe RGB coverage and therefore greater Rec 2020 coverage in the green region of the gamut, but still good vibrancy. Lara's headpiece as well with the green feathers, that highlights some really nice vibrant shades as well. And this sky, good level of vibrancy there, but not overdone, not cartoonish. The reds here, again, toned down compared to under SDR, but still a good level of vibrancy. Nice look to the gold there. The fire, also toned down compared to SDR, but nice and vibrant. Some really nice strong oranges there, but not oranges that verge onto red like they did under SDR. I actually prefer the color reproduction on this model to the ViewSonic slightly under HDR, because I mentioned that there's some residual oversaturation with the ViewSonic because of how they'd mapped things. The Philips really does a better job at showing the vibrant shades well, but also showing the more muted shades appropriately muted. This looks more as I'd expect to see under HDR. So there's not really much more to say about this monitor under HDR. I think it does pretty well on the color side, does well on the contrast side. Yes, it's not as good as per pixel illumination would give you on an OLED, and there are some issues in terms of the crushing of detail where darker and medium dark shades dominate. And of course I have been considering HDR as a sort of a static thing in this section like I usually do. You do have to consider that you're going to be observing motion a lot of the time, and there are some weaknesses in terms of pixel responsiveness, and there's something which I've explored in the responsiveness section or the responsiveness video. And just the final thing to mention, I also observed a lot of HDR movie content, and like games, some titles make better use of HDR10 than others, but I really made very similar observations in terms of what was impressive and what was less impressive there. I'm on Battlefield 5 again, and I'm going to talk about the responsiveness of the monitor. This monitor has 165Hz refresh rate, and I've got the game running at a good solid 165 frames a second at the moment, so I'm making the most out of the monitor in terms of its responsiveness. This high refresh rate does a few things for you. I'm sure many of you will be aware of this by now, but for those who aren't, or those who want a bit of a refresher, it greatly improves the connected feel, which describes the precision and the fluidity when you're interacting with the game world. And that is something which is also aided by low input lag. And this monitor does have low input lag. I measured around 3 milliseconds. That indicates a really nice low signal delay on this monitor, so that's not a particular thing that you have to concern yourself with. The other advantage of this high refresh rate, high frame rate combination is that it reduces the perceived blur due to eye movement. So there are two main forms of perceived blur when you observe motion on a monitor. One is linked to the movement of your eyes, and that is something which the high refresh rate and high frame rate will help with. The other is related to the pixel responses, also very important. And there's a nice method of capturing both elements of perceived blur called pursuit photography, and that is explored a little bit in the responsiveness section of the written review and in more detail in a responsiveness article linked to there. So if you're interested in the technical side of things, definitely check that out. But I'm going to show you some pursuit photographs on the screen with this monitor running at 165 Hz. In the written review, there are various other examples at lower refresh rates as well, if you're interested in that. But what you can see here are some distinct weaknesses. So there are different overdrive settings, or smart response as they call them on this monitor, off, fast, faster and fastest. First of all, we can rule out fastest as a useful setting. Even for the transitions shown here, there's obvious overshoot. You can see an obvious colourful trail behind the UFO and an inky look for the dark background behind the UFO. Again, overshoot there, different manifestation of that, but it's not attractive. In practice, you can also see some overshoot artifacts, so there's sort of an interlaced appearance to the overshoot. And some transitions show really extreme levels of overshoot with this setting. So it's not a useful setting. Faster, on the other hand, that's the best you'll do without any real issues with overshoot. But even then, there are some issues with slower than optimal pixel transitions. So if you compare this to the reference screen, the AOC CQ32G3SU, that is a VA reference, that is what I consider quite an average or slightly above average really VA performer. And that does actually outperform this Philips. And the M27Q, that is a reasonable IPS model. It's not the fastest IPS model out there, but it's at a reasonable level, and that comfortably outperforms this Philips at 165 Hz. The Philips here performs very similar to that ViewSonic alternative that I've mentioned a few times in the review so far. I'd say that the Philips is better tuned at lower refresh rates, and I will get onto that a little bit later. But for these high refresh rates, very similar weaknesses here. You can see smeary trailing behind, particularly for the dark background, that's the top row. Also a fair bit for the medium background, that's the middle row. Performance is a bit better for the light background, but still not perfect, that's the bottom row. So for this scene here, the performance isn't too bad, and that's because there are lots of medium and brighter shades where the pixel transitions are quite reasonable, actually, more reasonable than you saw with Test UFO just then, but there are some darker shades mixed in, so the dark shade there at the edge of the wall with the medium sky in the background. Yeah, there's some smeary trailing. You can also see this kind of thing if there are brightly saturated objects. I haven't really got any particularly good examples here, but brightly painted objects, for example, sort of a bit for this cloth here with medium backgrounds. You can also see this smeary trailing, more distinct weaknesses. Jumping into another scene, this one is dominated more by darker shades, so there are some transitions with which this monitor does struggle with. And, you know, I can see the smeary trailing around the flag there, around the canoes down here, and I'm just circling the mouse a bit to try and also the rock there, just circling the mouse a bit to show this more clearly, but linear motions will show it as well. It just shows it a bit more clearly on the video. Definite weaknesses. Doesn't really need too much more of an explanation. Makeshift roof as well, smeary trailing. There's nothing really in the way of overshoot that jumps out. It's just a little bit of overshoot in places, but it's just not obvious. If you want to, of course, speed things up and use the fastest setting, then I hope you like overshoot. Looks absolutely beautiful, but really not what you want to see when you're gaming. Certainly not what I want to see when I'm gaming. So whether this is going to be too much for you, I'm back to my preferred faster setting by the way, whether these weaknesses are going to be annoying to you, that's a very subjective and personal thing. It really just depends on your own sensitivities. And I also like to point out that it doesn't always manifest as smeary trailing. So whether mixtures of lighter and darker shade, medium dark and medium somewhat brighter shades, if that makes sense, to the bush here, what happens is the brighter shades darken during movement and they brighten up correctly when the movement ceases. So that can give you a flickering effect. during movement, which some people can find a bit annoying as well. And you can also see this kind of thing on the desktop. It's not just on games where you can notice these weaknesses, and also a bit on movies, although they'll be at a lower frame rate, so the weaknesses aren't as pronounced there. And I do explore this a bit more in the written review, but there were some weaknesses even for movie content, but they just aren't as pronounced. But on the desktop, it depends on the scrolling behavior, but I've got Twitter on dark mode here, or lights out as they call it, and if you look at the light grey there, it blends into black during movement and then lightens up when the movement ceases, and that's again the flickering effect. It depends on the scrolling behavior though, or the browser you're using. I'm using Firefox here, but I've just hopped onto Google Chrome. This has different scrolling behavior. On Twitter at least, it scrolls more of the screen at the same time, so you don't get that kind of flickering effect, and you don't really notice smeary trailing with how the scrolling behavior works here. And also, if you're looking at websites with dark text against a light background, these sort of weaknesses aren't really apparent there either. But it does depend on what you're viewing, and when you're moving windows around and in certain applications with high frame rate animations, then yeah, these weaknesses can be apparent. I'm just going on to Gigabyte's website because for some reason that even on Google Chrome shows some quite clear weaknesses, even when you're just scrolling. So yes, there's certainly a lot of the smeary trailing going on here. This monitor does support VRR, variable refresh rate, and it can be used with adaptive sync and also HDMI 2.1 VRR, which is integrated into HDMI 2.1. That means you can use it with the PS5, which doesn't support adaptive sync, and you can use AMD FreeSync, and you can use NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode. So you can have lots of options with VRR on this one, but the performance isn't perfect. It has an advertised 48 to 165 Hz VRR range. I found that that was more like 55 to 165 Hz most of the time, but below the floor of operation, so 55 Hz or what would be a claimed 48 Hz, LFC, low frame rate compensation, kicks in, and that keeps tearing and stuttering at bay as well by keeping the refresh rate at a multiple of the frame rate. The technology does work in terms of the removal of tearing and stuttering, and if you're sensitive to that kind of thing, it's really nice to have this. But be aware that when LFC does activate, there's a momentary stuttering when it activates or deactivates in either direction basically. And that's not great if you're frequently passing the boundary and you're sensitive to that, but if you're not, or you're only occasionally passing the boundary, it's not something I'd worry about too much. Something which may be more of an issue is VRR flickering. So when that boundary is crossed, the refresh rate suddenly doubles or suddenly jumps up to nearly double. That's a big change. And equally, when the frame rate of your game is fluctuating heavily, even without LFC being crossed, then VRR flickering can become rather extreme, rather obvious on this model. So I'm just running a VRR flickering test, and this will specifically cause significant fluctuations in the refresh rate. It's going all over the place, and I can see obvious flickering throughout this gradient. So for the darker shades, the medium shades, and the brighter end, basically for all of these shades, obvious flickering. Now, this is something which is common on VA models to some degree, and also OLEDs actually, but OLEDs, it's focused more on the darker shades, and that's because the contrast is so strong, and there are some slight gamma changes which are just apparent because the contrast is so strong. On models where the contrast is significantly weaker, so particularly your IPS models, TN models, then VRR flickering doesn't really manifest itself even for the darker shades because the contrast just isn't strong enough to sort of show these particular gamma shifts. But with VA models, there are also some voltage sensitivities to be aware of, and that's what causes these issues for brighter shades as well. So the flickering is more widespread. If I open up the OSD, you'll see that the refresh rate is really going all over the place, massive fluctuations. You're unlikely to see such extreme fluctuations in games. It can happen in some scenes though. Back to the game now. I've got it running at 100 frames a second, and I can see some flickering even though the refresh rate is quite stable. But I did notice that when the fluctuations aren't too high and the frame rate is at least in the triple digits or high double digits, I didn't have the same level of VRR flickering that I noticed on the ViewSonic alternative, because with the ViewSonic it was actually so intense and so extreme, so widespread that I had to disable VRR I couldn't bear to use it. Whereas on the Philips, I would actually use VRR, at least with my RTX 3090, which I'm using at the moment. And if I'm able to at least have decent, sort of fairly stable frame rates. But yes, those greater fluctuations, which can happen from time to time, can cause more noticeable issues. And again, even when it's quite stable, there are some issues. So if you're sensitive to flickering, then this could be annoying. But aside from that, VRR does work well. So at 100 Hz as I'm running at the moment, the weaknesses are a bit less pronounced than they were at 165 Hz in terms of the smeary trailing, because the pixel response requirements are reduced now, but it's still there, certainly there. I don't really see anything untoward in the way of overshoot, nothing that really jumps out there. 80 frames a second now, more of the same. Again, a bit of a reduction in the smeary trailing, a little bit of overshoot creeping in, but nothing that's particularly pronounced even here, so that's good to see. And 60 frames a second. Even now, there are some weaknesses in terms of smeary trailing which do persist, but certainly less pronounced than they were at higher frame rates. The pegs on the roof here, with the medium to dark shades in the background, yeah, that does show some quite distinct weaknesses even at 60 Hz. A bit of that going on with the boats down there again, and the rock, and this flag. So yeah, even here, there are some weaknesses in pixel responsiveness. But nothing that jumps out too much in the way of overshoot. There is some halo trailing now around the tree, which I notice. So it's brighter than the background and stands out a bit for that reason. But I wouldn't say this is extreme overshoot. If you want to completely remove the overshoot, then you're going to have to actually turn the overdrive off. So if you set it to fast, then it actually increases the smeary trailing. But the overshoot really persists in a fairly similar way. Perhaps it's reduced a bit for this transition, but just observing more broadly, there are definitely some instances where overshoot's really just as obvious with faster and fast, in my view. So I've now set it to off, which completely eliminates the overshoot, but also the smeary trailing is now extreme. It's just horrible, a huge amount of additional perceived blur. So back to 165 Hz and my preferred faster setting now. Just to summarise really, the monitor doesn't offer a particularly compelling pixel response experience. I would say that it was nice to see a bit less VRR flickering than I saw on the ViewSonic, and less than I've seen on some VA models more broadly, but it is still a potential issue. Input lag is nice and low. I just have to stress how subjective it is. For some people, the responsiveness will be okay here, but this is marketed as a gaming monitor, and for me, even when I was playing games casually, I just found the responsiveness too weak. I'm quite sensitive to it though, so, you know, take that for what it's worth. But I do feel that even for casual games, this can be a bit of a pain at times. Also, the monitor doesn't have a strobe backlight setting. It doesn't have a black frame insertion mode, if you prefer to call it that. The ViewSonic did have one, but it wasn't a particularly good one, so I don't see this as a huge loss. And really, this panel just isn't fast enough to make a good go of that kind of setting. To wrap up then, the styling of the monitor is quite nice. I find it quite refreshing, actually. It's different to usual. I like that Philips has sort of put themselves out there a bit with the styling. And I've seen some similar styling elements with other Evnia products as well. And it's not just style over substance either. I found the monitor nice and solid as well. Nice coated metal stand neck and good weighty feel overall. Not excessive wobble when I was moving the screen or anything like that. And good ergonomic flexibility. The lighting solution, AmbiGlow, is actually very usable as well. It's not just a gimmick like RGB lighting is on many monitors. It does actually give a really nice pool of light behind the monitor, so it can be used as a bias light or just some fancy effects if you like that kind of thing, as I'm showing you here with the rainbow mode. 3440 by 1440, 21 by 9, the usual kind of experience there. I found the curve as well worked well on this one. It was easy to adapt to, natural. The contrast performance is really the main strength of this one. Good performance there. Not OLED-like by any means, but still decent, and certainly as far as LCDs go, good performance. Bit of VA glow, bit of black crush, nothing extreme. In terms of colour reproduction, the monitor offered vibrant colour output, so people who like that kind of thing, this will probably hit the spot for them. There were some losses of saturation lower down the screen towards the edges, so peripherally basically. But these weren't extreme for a VA model, and about as good as I've seen from a VA ultrawide really. And even with this in mind, the colour gamut was generous, particularly in the red region. So this gave nice pop to red biased shades in particular. And it does have a nice functional sRGB mode with adjustable brightness, and that worked well to give a more muted and more as the developers intend look for most content you consume, which is designed with the sRGB colour space in mind. The DCI-P3 coverage, 95%, good enough I'd say for colour critical work within that space, but when I say colour critical, really I'd say more hobbyist level for any VA model, and that includes this one because of the gamma and colour shifts which I've mentioned, but it is at least usable there. And the Adobe RGB coverage at 90%, I wouldn't say that's good enough for work within that colour space, but certainly for sRGB and DCI-P3, decent potential there. HDR is of course a big headline feature of this monitor with its 1152 dimming zone mini LED backlight solution, and it did work very well in terms of outputting strong brightness even where bright shades dominated. It did much better than OLED in that respect as well. And it also was able to dim the zones very well for darker shades, but a bit too well I'd say, because when there were mixtures of darker and medium dark shades, it tended to crush detail. A lot of the detail was lost. This is expected to some extent with all mini LED backlight solutions, unless they're extremely sort of bright biasing, and that's going to cause other issues. But with this model, there were certainly some tweaks that I feel could be made with the local dimming algorithm, which would improve that kind of thing. There weren't really any massive issues with haloing either. There's a little bit, so you don't get per pixel illumination or precision there, but it did tend to dark bias a lot, which helped reduce the halos, and because it's a VA panel with natively strong contrast, they just naturally weren't such an issue anyway. I think it did well on the colour side under HDR, decent DCI-P3 coverage, and actually some extension beyond that, some encroachment onto Rec 2020, particularly for the red to blue edge of the gamut. Allowed a good level of vibrancy where the developers wanted it, and good muted look elsewhere, and it was a bit better than the ViewSonic alternative when it came to its HDR colour performance, I felt, as the ViewSonic tended to oversaturate even where it shouldn't. The responsiveness of the monitor, that was very similar to the ViewSonic really, similar weaknesses. SME retrailing was an issue, or potential issue, if you're sensitive to that kind of thing. Even when I was on the desktop, I noticed it. Casually gaming, I noticed it. And certainly when I was gaming more competitively, I found it quite annoying. Something I'm quite sensitive to. Not everyone will be so sensitive to it, but it really is an issue. I can't escape that it's an issue with this model. But aside from that, 165 Hz was put to good use in terms of low input lag, and you did get some benefits from the high refresh rate, even with those weaknesses in pixel responsiveness. VRR worked largely as it should in terms of removing tearing and stuttering, worked on my AMD and Nvidia GPUs. HDMI 2.1 also features, which is good for integrated VRR support. Should also add that the monitor does have a downsampling mode if you're using HDMI 2.1, which means it can run at 3840 by 2160 4K UHD, but for some reason that was limited to 60 Hz. There's no bandwidth reason for this limitation, so it's just a sort of potential thing they could add in firmware, 120 Hz mode for the 4K UHD resolution. It's not really something that's going to appeal particularly broadly, but if you're using this as a secondary use for games consoles, because ultrawides really aren't meant for games consoles as a primary use, but as a secondary use, it would have been nice to have seen 120 Hz downsampling mode, and that's something which the ViewSonic alternative does offer. VRR flickering then, the ViewSonic was worse in that respect, but this monitor did still have some issues with VRR flickering, particularly during heavy fluctuations in frame rate. So really to just conclude, it isn't an easy monitor to generally recommend because of the weaknesses in pixel responsiveness, some of the issues with HDR tuning as well, with the lack of detail. So it's just some sort of potentially annoying aspects, I'd say. For some people, those issues won't be so annoying, but it does come at a significant price premium over some alternatives, QD OLED alternatives, the AW3423DW, and I can't hide the fact that the pixel responsiveness is night and day different, so much better on the QD OLED monitors. Per pixel illumination is also nice, contrast advantages there under HDR and SDR. The colour consistency is better, it doesn't have the kind of issues with loss of saturation peripherally, that kind of thing. But on the flip side, the VA panel used here has normal RGB subpixels, so you don't have to worry about sort of fringing and that kind of thing, and it has a much higher SDR brightness. It can sustain its brightness better under HDR, and I was certainly more impressed with how it represented bright scenes than I would be with the QD OLED alternatives. But yeah, again, that price premium, you're looking at around $2,000 US, 2,000 euros for this Philips. The QD OLED's closer to $1,200 to $1,300. For the Dell Alienware AW3423DW is still my preferred choice of QD OLED. I do actually like the G-Sync module. It does have some benefits which sensitive users like me can appreciate in terms of a bit of a smoother experience, and just the HDR tuning seems to be just that bit better than on some of the other QD OLED monitors without the G-Sync module. So Nvidia does have a little bit of a hand in how things are tuned there. Anyway, not to get too much off track, I just wanted to mention, I really would sort of more generally recommend the QD OLED alternatives. But if you don't want to worry about burn-in, you don't want to worry about subpixel issues, although I would add that I haven't had any issues with burn-in on my AW3423DW after nearly a year of use now, including a lot on the desktop, without taking any sort of super high precautions. I don't hide my desktop taskbar or anything like that. So I would say that don't be too scared about burn-in on the monitors. I'd say give them a go, these QD OLED monitors, because they really do offer a lot. But if they're not for you, then that's fine, and you really do prefer VA models, then do check this Philips out. It might just be the kind of experience that you're after. I know I said I was going to keep this review a little bit more brief because of my throat, but I have to say I got a bit carried away as usual. Certainly had a lot to say about it, but that's really all there is to the Philips Evnia 34M2C7600MV. Bit of a mouthful. Be sure to check out the full written review on PCmonitors.info. There's a link to that in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do. Also be aware that liking the video, subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, a nice way of showing your support.